Welcome back, and in this video I'll be giving you some information on hypothesis driven development. So I feel that every product owner or BA needs to know this because it's a very good way of building products. Okay, so let's get into it without any delay. So, what is this hypothesis driven development? So, hypothesis driven development is a prototype methodology that enables product groups to develop, test, and build a product that is acceptable by users. Now, this is very important. As I mentioned in previous videos, many organizations and companies they build products, but most of the time around 70 to 80% of products fail because they assumed that people would need that particular application or product, but that's not exactly what the users wanted. That does not solve their needs. So it was not very well accepted by users, which led to the failure of many products. So in order to release products that are successful in a way that is acceptable by users, hypothesis driven development proves to be a very good methodology that can be used. So it is an iterative measure that explores assumptions. So these assumptions are called as hypothesis, and it attempts to validate it with user feedbacks. So how do you know that a user is ready to adopt to a particular product or feature? Unless it satisfies their needs. Okay, so you might have an idea or assumption that this particular feature or product is going to help a user or customer base out. So when do you know whether really that has helped them? Only when they get to use it and provide their feedback. So that is what this hypothesis driven development aims to achieve. So users have different needs and likings. Okay, not every time what you think, okay, is the best for users tend to be the best for users. Okay, as I said initially, what you think may not always be right for the end users. So hypothesis driven development, it rules out any uncertainties or assumptions that arise during product development. So during product development, sometimes we do make assumptions. Probably this feature might be really helpful for users, or maybe this you make certain assumptions, or you're really uncertain around certain features or the product whether really it's going to satisfy their needs. So all these uncertainties and assumptions that arise during this particular phase of product development, you can actually rule them out with hypothesis driven development. And this tends to work well for products and not for services, because services, the users come and they mention what exactly they need. But when you build a product and you want to take it out to the market, there's always this small percentage of uncertainty or assumptions that you tend to come across, and that proves to be well done with hypothesis driven development. So I hope you're getting a little bit of what this hypothesis driven development is. So when you look at the process, so there are basically 5, or sometimes you see that there are 6 stages. So the first one is you need to write down assumptions, ideas, or any questions that you have during product development. And once you write them down, you need to prioritize these assumptions, ideas, or questions. And because it's very necessary, you may have hundreds of ideas, you may have hundreds of assumptions, but not everything needs to be addressed at one go. So at that time, you need to filter out and prioritize what are the main ideas that need to be validated, what are the main assumptions that need to be addressed. So the second step is to prioritize things. The third one is to define a hypothesis. So once you have prioritized these assumptions, then you define a hypothesis. Once you've defined the hypothesis, you need to test it out and see whether the hypothesis is a failure or a success. And the fifth one is to learn. You need to learn from from the results that you get from the experimentation or the test phase of the hypothesis. So let's get to see each one in detail. So the first one is to write down assumptions, ideas, or questions. So jot down any assumptions, ideas that you have, okay? Bring the product team together, write down whatever assumptions you have, ideas, stuff like that. Do not think about the outcome, okay? So the main goal in this phase is to just write down everything that's at the top of your head, what you feel is a good, great idea, assumptions that you have made, everything you just write down. So it's not necessary that you have a solution for that idea or for that assumption at that point of time, but just write it down, okay? And you can even use the how might we technique to define the question or the phrase. So you might have certain questions also in your head. So there is this technique called as how might we, okay, which helps you to write questions that are at the top of your head. So for example, how might we reduce the time teams it's actually spend, it's a typo. So the teams spend in manual infrastructure provisioning. So these are certain questions you have, and these questions will lead to open discussions. It'll open up brainstorming discussions and ideas and stuff like that. So you just need to write all your questions down. It can be in the form of stickies or in any way that best suits your team. Once you have this, the next stage is to prioritize these ideas, assumptions, or questions. The main objective of prioritizing these things is to address these ideas and assumptions and questions. So once you have the assumptions and ideas in place, it's time to prioritize. So you can use any prioritization technique. Dot voting tends to be a very great technique for these scenarios. So you have all your ideas, assumptions, and questions out there, and now the team needs to vote for what is the priority that they need to focus on. What is the thing that they need to start validating? So then, using the dot voting technique, they can prioritize. So if you don't know how to go about dot voting, I have taken a video on that and I'll share the link in the description box. You can take a look at it. So once you have prioritized these ideas and assumptions and questions, the next one is to define a hypothesis. So at this stage, you have this idea and you feel that it's going to work out, so you need to test it out. So before testing it out, you need an hypothesis. So for example, any assumptions or ideas or questions, they tend to develop into a hypothesis. So in the previous example, how might we reduce the time teams spend in manual infrastructure provisioning? So one possible solution to that is infrastructure automation. So you believe that automation could relieve teams from this manual work, but that's just an assumption. So this becomes a hypothesis, and this is the structure of an hypothesis. So we believe that we will be able to achieve some business outcome if the persona, who is the persona that we are trying to address? If the persona solves their need, what is their need? The user outcome. If they solve their need using the feature that you're trying to address, the feature you're trying to introduce. So if you see, for example, we believe that we will achieve quicker and easier infrastructure provisioning if IT infrastructure teams solve their need in having to provision infrastructure for various departments' demands using the automation process provided by our application. So this is the hypothesis. And next, what you have to do, you need to test this out and see whether really automation is solving the IT team's headache of manual work, okay, of manual infrastructure provisioning. So now when you test the hypothesis, there are different ways in which you can validate this hypothesis if it's true or false. So this can be done with various methods. It can be done through interviews, surveys, user research, prototypes, stuff like that, okay? It depends on what works well for your team, for the target audience that you are trying to communicate and address to. So also you need to be careful on what method you're choosing, provided that it's not, a big headache for people. Sometimes large surveys, people don't actually like large surveys. They don't have the time. Interviews sometimes work well. So you need to choose the right balance between what works well. And the next one is be careful about the sample you choose to test your hypothesis. So you need to choose the right users, a right sample of users without any bias to test out the hypothesis. Okay? Only when you test out your hypothesis with the right sample of users, the results tend to be unbiased. Okay? So the next one is also make sure the test can be done with minimal effort and time. So most of the time teams would not have time to, do this hypothesis testing. But to rule out uncertainties, you need to see some hypothesis testing method that works really well with a limited period of time and minimal effort. Okay, in that way, if you're able to validate, then it's a great success for your team. So also define the success metrics. So what is the success metrics that I need to define in order to say that the hypothesis is going to be a success or not, or whether I have achieved or the hypothesis is true. It validates that my assumptions are right. Okay, so you need to define these success metrics also. So if you see at the end of the hypothesis testing phase, the outcomes could be either the hypothesis was the entire hypothesis test was a success or a failure. So usually that is defined either true or false in binary terms. And also teams tend to define and rate what was the effort that was taken in order to conduct this hypothesis testing. And once you get all the results from the hypothesis, it can be a qualitative or it can be a quantitative results that you might get. But if it's going to be qualitative, you tend to group them up into pros, cons, and neutral comments that or feedbacks that you have got from the users. And based on all these results is what you need to do in the next phase is you need to learn from these results. Okay, so the entire exercise is a learning process. So if at all the hypothesis test that you ran was a failure, okay, people really, you thought something would work well. You thought, for example, in our example, that automation would have been helpful to your teams, but they still feel that no, automation is still not going to help them. So it's not a failure, I would say, this entire process that you ran. You just came to know and you learned something new, that automation is just not their cup of tea. Automation is just not something that can solve their problem. So you would start looking for other options and alternatives. So you need to think of this entire process as a learning process. If you learn something, if something is validated and if it's right, you implement. If it's not right, then you exclude that option and you check for alternatives. So the outcome can be successful or it might not give the desired outcomes. So if they are positive, then as I said, you tend to implement and build that solution. But if not, then you learn and you fine tune your discovery process with other alternatives. So that's about the hypothesis driven development. And it's really great when you get to validate ideas because, as I said, then it rules out all uncertainties that teams have and it provides more customer satisfaction and user acceptance. Okay, so whenever you have the chance of running these hypothesis driven developments, try to do it as minimal as possible with less time and less effort, and maybe probably comment and tell us how was this um, entire process is. And definitely this would be helpful when you have a small budget, when you have a small team and you just don't want to waste time building features or products and not knowing whether it's going to be a success. This definitely works well. So I hope that you got some information on this concept. So if you like this, please do give this video a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe to this channel and do share your feedbacks. Thank you.